Hi, welcome to another episode of Trial by Podcast. I'm Julia.
I'm Finn.
And I'm Pav.
And today we're going to be discussing all things e-bikes. Is it just me, or are roads absolutely full of e-bikes?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I grew up on the northern beaches and I feel like they're prolific in that area right now. But I hear they're not as crazy in the west.
Yeah, I feel like there's not a lot that I've seen, and all the content I get about e-bikes are from TikToks or like Facebook videos, so not a lot in the West.
No, you guys are so right. If you frequent the northern beaches, the eastern suburbs, or maybe some other coastal spots in New South Wales, you've probably seen these e-bikes. Maybe you've seen an ungodly swarm of them, a child ripping past you on the wrong side of the road, or even the takeover of the harbour bridge.
Making U-turns in front of traffic in a TikTok tango with trucks.
This could have very easily ended in many deaths.
This is Grand Bike Auto in peak hour.
No consequences, no idea who they are. Desperate police appealing to parents.
Australia relaxing some of the import regulations has allowed these bikes to flood the market. There's an estimated 760,000 of them in New South Wales alone. They're mostly in coastal spots. Think high-income households and suburbs without amazing public transport. While to some, they're a taste of freedom, adventure, and a reason to stop scrolling and actually go outside, they also come with major risks. In 2024, there were 226 injuries from e-bikes, and in 2025, that number was exceeded in just 7 months. St. Vincent's reported 200 people with e-bike injuries that required a trauma team response in their emergency department alone last year, with 10% requiring intensive care treatment and more than half being admitted to hospital. Almost 100 children were injured while riding e-bikes in 2025, and we're starting to see deaths too. So while obviously there are certain benefits to these, there are clearly risks too. Finn, what's currently the rules and the regulations around e-bikes in New South Wales?
Yeah, so it's a bit of the wild, wild west at the moment. So on private property, anything seems to go. But when riding on public roads, only 2 types of e-bikes are allowed. We thought it would be good to flag to the listeners at this point that we might be getting a little bit technical on the pod. So the first is power-assisted pedal cycles. These are bicycles equipped with an electric motor with a maximum output of 200 watts, but they cannot be propelled by the motor alone. The bike must weigh less than 50 kilograms and have a height-adjustable seat. The second category is electrically powered assisted cycles. These may have a maximum continuous power rate of up to 500 watts, but the motor assisted is restricted, so the power output must progressively reduce once the bike exceeds 6 kilometers per hour. So in both categories, the rider must actively be propelling the bike by pedaling, with the motor providing assistance only, rather than serving as a primary source of propulsion. So I feel like both those make getting around the city way easier. By contrast, though, all petrol-powered bicycles are illegal in New South Wales roads. Similar restrictions apply in other states. So in Western Australia, they've enacted laws allowing police to seize and destroy illegal bikes. And in late March, the New South Wales government proposed legislation to grant New South Wales police comparable enforcement powers. So beyond this, however, regulation is relatively limited, as I said before. So apart from the standard bicycle rules, such as mandatory helmet use and restrictions on footpath riding, there's no broader regulatory framework. In particular, there are no rules governing who may ride e-bikes. There are no licensing systems, no minimum age requirements, and no limits on carrying passengers. So at the same time, the rapid growth of e-bike use has driven equally rapid law enforcement. Against this backdrop, today we'll unpack the key legal and regulatory changes that emerges in 2025 and 2026. So Pav, what's going to change?
I'm so glad you asked. So basically, New South Wales, a parliamentary committee inquiry into the use of e-scooters, e-bikes, was established on the 6th of June of 2024. This basically initiated the subsequent changes to the e-bike landscape. The inquiry delivered a very detailed report with 34 recommendations that included changes to better control their use and urged the government to essentially crack down on illegal e-bike uses. The final report, which was released in February of 2025, was influential in shaping the subsequent action plan and the legislative form, which will be discussed throughout the episode. Julia, can you give us a rundown as to what actually is the action plan and what came out of that inquiry?
Yeah, of course. So what was introduced was the e-micromobility action plan. by the New South Wales government, which is aimed at making e-bikes and e-scooters safer, easier to use, and more mainstream. First, newer and clearer rules. The government is updating the legal definition of e-bikes, moving towards controlled legislation of e-scooters, boosting enforcement powers, and tightening battery safety rules to cut down on fire risks. So thinking back to that technical definition, focusing on power wattage, on the need for pedaling to be involved on top of a motor, and for there to not be the ability to tamper with the maximum speed. Next is more money for better infrastructure. There's major investments going into cycleways, better bike and e-scooter parking at train station and transport hubs, and dozens of safe riding projects funded through the Get New South Wales Active program. Third is education and safety campaigns. This includes statewide safety messaging, school resources, clearer shared path signage, and practical advice on charging and disposing of batteries safely. And finally, better data and smarter planning. Shared e-scooter and bike operators will have to share data, crash reporting will be improved, and New South Wales will keep working with other states on consistent national rules. Overall, the plan is about making e-micromobility safer, cleaner, and a normal part of how people get around New South Wales, not just a niche option.
It seems so hard for the government to balance an easy transport option, like for kids and young people, with also safety concerns. Do you feel like that's the case, Pav?
Yeah, I do agree. I feel like there's so many things to consider, and it is quite a big task for the government to obviously weigh up all the factors and to, consider the fact that it is very easy transport, and with all the other things that come with, motor vehicles and rise in technology.
Yeah, and I definitely think that if we're going to be having more young people on the road, it's really good that they're not just focusing on what bikes can be allowed, but on, the broader things of making the road safer and really educating the kids. But something I think is interesting is that there doesn't seem to be much regulation in that around who can ride bikes. Is there any more information coming out on that, Finn?
Yeah, so while that plan wasn't legislation, it absolutely started something. So it triggered the safety reviews that led to pushing for the minimum age on e-bikes in New South Wales. So the New South Wales government announced in February 2026 that it will introduce a legal minimum age for the riding of e-bikes as part of a staged suite of reforms aimed to address rising safety concerns, as we've already mentioned today. So according to the ministerial media release published on the 20th of Feb this year, the change is being driven by need to ensure, and I quote, primary school aged children are not trying to control e-bikes that in some cases are heavier than them, noting the increased crash forces associated with heavier, faster devices. So the announcement describes the age limit restrictions as building on an e-bike reforms already announced by the government, which will be discussed later in the pod. So as previously mentioned, in New South Wales, e-bikes are equated with bicycles under certain circumstances, as mentioned before. There are no specific explicit mention of an age limit for riding e-bikes in this material, meaning under the current New South Wales road rules, children of any age may legally ride an e-bike, which has led to what the minister describes as, and I quote again, groups of teens piling on fat bikes, often 3 to a bike, raising questions about whether young riders possess the physical and cognitive capacity to safely operate these devices. So an expert review led by Transport for New South Wales is now considering an age threshold likely to recommend a legal minimum between the ages of 12 and 16 years. Informed by evidence from child development specialists, the New South Wales Office for Youth and Young People, and direct consultation with parents and young riders. So the review's findings are due in June of this year, and after which the government will determine a final age limit.
So once the new age limit has been set, how does it actually become law? Because so far it seems as though the government is just at the information gathering stage of this reform, right?
The New South Wales government will consider the recommendations and decide whether to implement the change through amendments to the Road Rules 2014 or through legislation amending the Road Transport Act 2013. Age limit changes can be enacted quickly by updating the road rules by the Minister and Governor without inquiring passage through Parliament. So broader powers will be facilitated through amendments to primary legislation as seen in the current Road legislation amendments in brackets e-bike regulation close brackets bill 2026, which proposes changes to both the Act and the road rules. So this reform aligns with broader safety measures announced concurrently with enhanced police powers and battery safety standards, which I think we'll go into later in the pod. So yeah, that's a big change for the landscape, particularly for kids. How do you think that'll impact like children getting around on bikes and parents maybe commuting or taking their kids to sport and things like that?
Yeah, it's funny because my first instinct is, if you have to be 16 to drive a car, how can we be letting, younger children on these e-bikes? But I'm guessing when we think back to what the whole focus of the legislation is, it's getting these e-bikes away from feeling like a car and feeling more like a bike, limiting the speed and limiting how much we're relying on a motor. So then when I think of it like that, it does seem reasonable that they're taking time to, consider who can physically lift these bikes, balanced with, not overreaching on kids getting around. I mean, it would be a huge, leap of independence for a lot of these kids, especially, with fuel crises and areas of not great public transport. It's a great option, obviously, for them to be able to get where they want to go. Pav?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it comes back again, like the government does have a big burden in essentially trying to grapple with safety versus accessibility, right? Like you said, like there's so many places where public transport isn't as accessible. And so this is like the easy solution. So I think the way that the government is also trying to navigate this is they're also introducing basically the European safety standards, which are European safety standards EN 15194. Because it is a mouthful, we're just going to call it the European standards. So basically the same announcement in February, the New South Wales government that confirmed that it's going to adopt the European standards alongside the minimum age initiatives. This basically is going to align local laws with the international standard that is at large, so that basically bikes must comply with the European standards in order for them to access and use the public roads and pathways without registrations or licensing. And those who fall outside of this will be considered as unregistered motor vehicles. So what are the European standards? Essentially, the standards impose that the motor output is capped at 250 watts. The pedal assist is cut off at 25 kilometers per hour. There's no power assist above 6 kilometers per hour unless you're pedaling. And there is strict electrical battery and fire safety standards and anti-tampering protection to prevent aftermarket speed or power modifications. I should note that the New South Wales reforms are now enforced at a Commonwealth level, with the federal government updating its import levels on the 19th of December 2025, requiring that e-bikes that are imported into Australia, they need to strictly meet these European standards, as confirmed by the Federal Transport Minister, Catherine King. Whilst this doesn't determine how the bikes are used within each state, they do stop non-compliant bikes from actually entering the market in Australia, which is vicariously supporting the New South Wales framework at large. At this juncture, it's also important to note that hundreds of thousands of e-bikes are currently already purchased, which are considered legal under the current, former Liberal government 2023 rule change, which did increase the allowable power from 250 watts to 500 watts. So, as such, the announcement did specify a 3-year transition period. So, from 1st of March 2029, only e-bikes that comply with the European standards will actually be allowed on New South Wales roads. And this also provides a grace period for those who do have the current bikes to maybe sort of get rid of it or, change their bikes.
I know my roommate rides his bike to work every day, and he will likely have a bike that won't comply once 2029 rolls around. So it's nice that they've allowed a grace period for people like my roommate to catch up.
Yeah.
So earlier today we were talking about enforcement powers of police. Is there anything that's changing in relation to e-bikes and police powers?
Yeah, so they've already started introducing new police powers to seize and crush illegal e-bikes. So as we were discussing earlier, there's obviously been quite a bit of anxiety and impact of these e-bikes. And, we've been specifying throughout this podcast that there is a difference between e-bikes that are, just straight up currently illegal, currently petrol powered, not really pedaling, basically just functioning as a motorbike, versus ones that, you are pedaling and they do feel more like an e-bike, but will soon be illegal because they don't comply with European standards. But already now there's been a reform that grants New South Wales Police and Transport expanded powers to seize and crush e-bikes as part of a broader crackdown on dangerous, high-powered, throttle-only devices that are essentially functioning as electrical motorbikes. The legislation significantly enhances the enforcement capability by extending seizure powers to police and transport authorised officers. Once the e-bikes become illegal, the police powers will start targeting those too. That means that if you're riding it and the police see you, they can take it from you then and there and address it, which I guess makes sense because it's quite clear if it's going above a certain speed, that it shouldn't be allowed because there are limits on the maximum speed. And, if you're going above that, you've either tampered with it or it's not proper.
How do they measure, or how do they know if your bike is illegal or exceeds a wattage limit?
So in terms of speed, obviously we have our normal mechanisms of checking the speed, but New South Wales will also become the first jurisdiction to deploy roadside dynamometer units, allowing police officers to immediately test whether a bike exceeds the 25-kilometre-hour cutoff or is running lawfully modified power systems. Again, this works alongside the broader Min's government focused on minimum age requirements, battery standards, and the legal definition. The ministers have made it clear that the powers and the laws are designed to remove illegal motorbikes from public spaces, empowering police to act immediately when bikes are ridden dangerously or illegally. I guess put simply by Minister for Transport John Graham, if it behaves like a motorbike, it's probably illegal and could end up in the crusher. So that's a wrap on the New South Wales government's planned and current reforms and legal approaches. But is anyone else in the industry, putting out policy or having thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I saw yesterday that the NRMA outlines further directions being explored. These include indications and registration schemes for young riders, insurance requirements akin to compulsory CTP style insurance, which I know, Pav, you're going to touch on later in the pod, and shared e-bike operator rules, which approved operators of shared e-bike services will need to hold comprehensive public liability insurance under a forthcoming bill, which you mentioned previously. And the NRMA emphasises in 2026 as a legislative line in the sand, responding to rising injuries and the need for enforceable standards. So it seems to be an issue that many organisations are recognising as a problem currently, and it's a safety concern. So they're all coming to the table and providing ways of solutions to make our roads safer for everyone. So in summary, e-bike riders in New South Wales can expect the following changes, which have already taken place or are likely to take place in the coming year. So minimum ride age, so likely, as we mentioned before, between 12 and 16 years, replacing the current any age rule. Mandatory EU standard e-bikes by the 1st of March 2029, which, as we mentioned previously, includes strict power, speed and safety requirements. Stronger enforcement measures including seizure and destruction of non-compliant devices and roadside speed tests as described as seize and destroy or crushing powers. And enhanced safety, education and infrastructure reforms as part of the broader e-micromobility action plan, which the government seems like they're aiming to address or have a proactive approach at reducing the likelihood that someone's going to find themselves in an accident as opposed to legislative pathways to sue someone. So do you think that's kind of a good summary of what the landscape is and what's happening?
Yeah, it sounds like it is, just on like the standards and what's to come as well. But I really do think that with all these proposed reforms, it's been great. But there's been a lot of questions, especially raised in regards to insurance, right?
Mm.
So if you're riding a car, motorbike, or anything on the roads, essentially insurance is a very big thing that you must consider, not just for the person who's riding the vehicle, but also just for the wider society, I suppose. So there's basically been what people are calling a compensation gap, where basically riders of e-bikes or pedestrians who have been involved in collisions have no insurance to cover the repairs or the medical costs that come out of these accidents. And the only sort of avenue is that victims can pursue a civil claim against the rider, usually negligence. But this really also depends on Medicare, income protection, or any third-party insurance that the rider or the household may have. So the current avenue just literally means higher rates of litigation, delayed time in actually receiving justice or compensation, and also, of course, just higher legal costs. So if there is no insurance coverage, the rider of the e-bike may have to compensate somebody they injured, such as a pedestrian, from their own pocket. And honestly, the chances of a 16-year-old having the capacity to compensate a fully grown adult for their time off of work or for their pain and suffering is negligible. And I also think it's quite difficult as well. So the practical reality is that the injured person will probably have to just absorb the loss themselves, really. And so some of the suggestions that have been made by the public and also some insurance councils as well then includes mandatory safety learner module, some sort of system of registration, licensing, and also just taking out a CTP green slip. So with such a system, the government must think about the affordability of all this. As the age range currently, it's looking like it's between 12 to 16 is being proposed, but the current landscape is actually 12 to 38. And once a mandatory age has been imposed, and for example, if it falls younger than 16 years old, will that mean parents are liable as well to, cover the damages caused by their 14-year-old son on an e-bike? Or would the 14-year-old be entirely responsible? Like, what do you guys think would be right or fair in the government sort of weighing all of this up? Additionally, there's also been proposed amendments to the Motor Accident Injuries Act of 2017, which basically functions to exclude e-bike accidents from the regime. So e-bike mobility accidents and vehicles are excluded from claims against the nominal defendant.
So what does that actually mean?
So it basically means that if an accident involves an uninsured vehicle, but only a micromobility device, there's no claim available under that legislative pathway. The only way to get compensation would be to pursue a personal injury claim against the rider, which obviously has all the downsides of civil litigation.
And I guess that goes to the same issue as before. What if the person you're suing doesn't really have the assets that an insurance company does? What do you get from suing a 14-year-old? Should their parents be liable? I'm not really sure how many victims want to be going to the High Court to be paving precedent on this.
Yeah, so I guess this is consistent with the government's approach. So limit the speed and power of these e-bikes so they fall under a category of bike rather than a motorbike or car. It makes sense their first focus is addressing public safety concerns and limiting accidents rather than broadening the avenues to be compensated in an injury.
Well, when you put it like that, I do feel a bit better. Yeah.
So I know that was a lot of information, and there's a lot of changes that are being proposed, but how do we feel about the proposed reforms, and do you think the government's going about it the right way and focusing on the right things?
Look, these e-bikes are popular and they're not going anywhere. They're seen as a convenient alternative to public transport, a cheaper, more climate-friendly alternative to cars, and a cheaper option, particularly with rising fuel prices. Age restrictions and regulations on the bikes could not come sooner. But we don't want the response to be entirely on police having to reprimand riders, especially when so many of them are children. Any changes that come need to be accompanied with important education on road rules, safety, and the importance of helmets. Maybe there should be some type of testing, like when you get your learner's license for a car, something that verifies these kids actually understand the road rules, since that's where they are going to be driving. The government does need to ensure it has considered everything and thought every avenue out before implementing these regulations and reforms. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for listening, and tune in next time for an episode of Trial by Podcast.